So it's really a team effort for everyone who has been involved. One of the things that we've really noticed, and I apologize for that little box up there, it's part of the recording of this that Mark wants us to do for the video. But one of the things we've seen over the past couple of decades or so is a real trend towards increasing sap yields. So back in the early 2000s, we were down around 0.2 to maybe a quart per gallon. But then over that time period, we've seen a fairly steady rise in sap yields, particularly in Vermont, which is great, but the U.S. in general, and also in Canada, especially within the last decade or so. There are some exceptions. 2012, for most of the U.S., really poor year due to very, very high temperatures. I'm sure many of you remember that. Canada, 2018, had a similar type of thing, just very poor weather. So, but for the most part, we can have fairly strong yields. It's important to recognize that these are averages over all different types of collection methods. And so what this probably reflects is that more and more people are adopting better collection approaches. Certainly not everybody, because with an average of about 0.3 to 0.4 of a gallon, we know that some producers can achieve 0.4, 0.5 or higher year after year after year with the occasional poor years due to weather. But for the most part, fairly high production can be achieved if we're doing best management practices, and we're really careful about what we do, and we're very cognizant of any type of problems that might occur during the season, and we fix them quickly. So what I'm going to go over is some of the important factors, certainly not all of them, and there are many, many other things we could talk about, but these are just a few of the things that we keyed in on as being quite important. And sort of as evidence of the possibility of doing high yields, this is the Proctor Maple Research Center annual production record since 2004. 2004, we retubed about 60% of our bush, and then again in 2009, we retubed the remainder of the bush. And the red line, this dashed line, is half a gallon per tap. That's our annual minimum target. And you can see that in 14 out of 15 years that are shown here, we achieved our minimum target, the only exception being 2012, again, because it was very, very hot. But if you look at 2012, the yield we had that year, 0.46, was better than any other year we'd had prior to retubing and adopting very high yield management practices. So we can't be too terribly upset by that. In about half the years, we exceed our long-term average of about 0.59 gallons per tap, or 6.5 pounds per tap. This isn't because we're doing anything really weird and experimental. It's just because we're following best management practices for the most part. In fact, if anything, these numbers are probably a little lower than they could be, because we often like to do things to compare to best management practices that either are some new things that we're going to try, or are some of the methods that are more standard in the industry that we want to use as comparisons. So these numbers could probably be a little bit higher if we were following best management practices throughout the entire bush.
Kevin, what is that 1,400, 5,000 tap?
Yeah, good question. So just about to mention that. 2004, when we started, we had about 1,400 taps. Now we're at 5,000 taps. So the other thing this shows is that you can continue this trend even with a decent number of taps. Now, as you get higher from this, it gets harder and harder. But with a reasonable number of taps, you are able to maintain fairly decent yields continuously. And there are producers who are matching what we can do, or even exceeding what we can do continuously year after year. So occasionally Mother Nature will screw with you, but if you use best management practices, most of the time you can minimize those types of losses. So really what we're talking about when we talk about high yield production is we want to do three things. We want to have very good yields, and that's this circle here, but we want to be able to do it at a decent net profit, because it's pretty easy to spend a lot of money in maple and lose a lot of money. But we have to make sure we're doing both of these things. Getting good yields, but doing it in a way that's very profitable, and also doing it in a way that's very, very sustainable. If we're doing that, then the producers are happy, the trees are healthy, and everything runs right. If we sort of forget about sustainability, then we can't maintain those yields for a long period of time. If we don't maintain decent net profits, then producers can't maintain it for a huge length of time either. So it's important we think about all these types of things as we're thinking about going towards higher yields. So what type of factors are driving the yields that we're observing higher, and how can producers actually manage to increase their yields while still maintaining a good net profit and sustainability? Well, there are several different categories of things that we can look at. Some of them are tree level factors, and we can manage those to some degree, not entirely, but at least there are some things that we can do. There are tapping practices that certainly have huge impacts on the yield. We'll talk about a few of those. Sanitation is very important. I'll just briefly mention that today, this morning, and then the next presentation focuses more on sanitation issues. And then there's vacuum. So it's certainly, again, not a comprehensive list of all of the things that we want to pay attention to, but it just hits on some of the bigger ones. Each of these actually has several different components. So for tapping practices, we can talk about 15 or 20 different things. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to focus on a few. And often many of these things are very, very interrelated. Particularly, we know about sanitation and vacuum, how they're related, and how the management of those two things affect each other. And so we're just going to go on to talk about some of the more important variables. And please do ask questions as I go along. I may defer them to a later point if they're already in my presentation, or try to answer them as. So first, just hit on some of the tree level factors. The first one is tree size, and you may think, well, there's not a whole lot to do about that, but tree size. This is a study Mark Iselhart and I did, and Dr. Vandenberg did continue in 2018, and will do again 2019. So this is tree diameter compared to sap yield. These are all on good vacuum, 25 inches or better. In 2 different years. 2016 are these light gray, and 2017 are the red dots. And you can see in general what we find is this fairly linear pattern of more sap yield with bigger size. And that just makes sense. You get a much, much bigger pipe or bigger reservoir to draw from. So the larger the tree is, the more sap you're going to get out of it. So a couple of things this tells us is that there's this very linear relationship, although there still is quite a lot of variability from tree to tree to tree, and that's natural. Part of it has to do with a taphole, part of it has to do with the tree genetics, but in general we see this fairly decent linear trend with increasing tree size. These very, very small trees only produce pretty low levels of sap. Even under high vacuum, these trees are only producing, 4 to 5 gallons of sap. Maybe this year they might have produced upwards of 10 gallons of sap. But I can tell you in 2016, the sap sugar content was pretty low in those trees, so we didn't get a whole lot out of them. So there's a couple of reasons you may not want to tap trees way down in that size, and this is a good example of one of those studies that we do tap trees for research, that very frequently you wouldn't tap for actual production, and we're doing it just to get the information. We're not doing it to actually collect the sap, and in fact, the sap from all these trees ended up being dumped on the ground, which is a little tough to take at times, but the value for us is in the research, not in actually making a syrup out of it. So you got to think about what the cost to actually get that much sap out of the tree is going to be for you. It's not inconsequential by the time you tube it and maintain the leaks and everything for trees that size to get only that small amount of sap. Some people will say, well, that's okay, I'm gonna thin these trees out with a tapping bit, and I can tell you from a growth standpoint, you're way better off to thin out these trees, leave a few of them for to have better growth and to get into these higher size classes much, much faster and produce more sap. So the general rule that we've established, and this may change as Dr. Vandenberg continues some of this research, is that for every 1 inch in diameter increase, the tree is going to produce about 2 gallons more additional sap. And that's if we're talking about 1 tap per tree. By the time you get up into these 2 tap trees, it's going to be a little different when you add a second tap in there. But we're talking about just 1 sap for every inch in diameter increases, you're going to get about 2 gallons more with tree-to-tree variation and annual variation as well. Now the difference for sap sugar with tree diameter sap sugar content is a little different. You see it isn't a straight line anymore, it's sort of a curve. And that curve is because these very, very small trees have pretty low sap sugar, and as you get bigger it increases, but it doesn't keep going up and up and up. It eventually just kind of tails off where the curve flattens off as you get into bigger size classes. And that's because these small trees are very, very suppressed, so they're going to have really low sugar content. See down in here, even not a whole lot of difference between 2016, 2017. Those trees are only producing maybe 1 to 1.5% sap sugar. By the time you get up into the dominant and codominant size class, those trees are producing more in the order of 1.5%, 2% in a normal year, 2016 being a low sugar year. But it does level off. The reason it levels off, you can sort of think as of the tree being limited by the amount of fuel it's getting, and the fuel is sunlight. Sunlight hitting the crown is the fuel for the engine of photosynthesis. So these really small trees that are suppressed or intermediate, they're not getting much sun, they're not getting much fuel, so they can't engage in making a lot of sugar. And if they can't make a lot of sugar, you're not going to get much sugar out of them. It just isn't that much. They're just kind of hanging on starvation wages. They're barely able to make enough sugar to hold in there. Their hope kind of is that one of these bigger trees next to them will die and they'll be able to grow and get up into the canopy. But if they don't, they're just going to grow really, really slowly and maybe eventually die. Once you get up into this level, they're much, much less fuel limited. And when they are, it tends to be more an issue of either not enough soil moisture, or it's too cloudy or too rainy or something going on. So these trees, the sap sugar is limited more by weather and genetics of the tree. They're getting enough fuel hitting the tops of the crowns, but they're being driven down to lower than their potential for some other reason, typically. So when you combine those two, when you look at syrup yield, the curve becomes a little bit more linear, where tree diameter to syrup yield in pounds is fairly linear from small trees right up to fairly big trees. And under high vacuum, the general rule is for every inch in diameter a tree increases, it will produce about 0.6 to 0.8 pounds more syrup. So by the time you get up into this size class where we're actually going to tap, you're going to maybe make 4 to 5 pounds of syrup. And as you get bigger and bigger with a single tap, you're going to make even more. So those really large trees, you can make a substantial amount of syrup. And so size really has a big impact on what your yields actually are. Sap sugar content is also related to sap yield with this sort of curve that happens. So what this is saying is these trees that are very small are down here. You're not getting much sap out of them, and you're not getting much sugar. As you push them off into these bigger size classes, these tend to be bigger trees up here. Both the sap yield and the sugar content is higher. So moving those trees up by encouraging them to grow by thinning or other types of management activities is really in your best interest in terms of sap yields. All right, so now, so basically what that tells us, the bottom line is that larger trees are going to produce more sap because they're essentially just a pipe standing there with sugar in them that you're collecting. And they're also going to produce sweeter sap because they're getting more fuel to the engine of photosynthesis. For every inch in diameter increase, the tree is going to produce about 2 gallons more sap, or on average about 7/10 of a pound more syrup. And that those small trees may not generate enough sap to offset the cost of actually running tubing to them, and the vacuum leaks, they're still going to produce gas, so you got to evacuate the tube with vacuum for every tap. The labor cost to put them in line is probably marginal at best. The better approach is probably to thin that section of the woods to produce better growth on the trees that either are your larger crop trees or are going to become your larger crop trees, to move them up into that area where they're productive faster. So we talked about that, a little bit about tapping and tapping history. If we look at trees after they've been tapped for a period of time, you can see this staining inside. That's a result of the tapping activities. Tapping always creates a wound in the tree, and we see it as stain when we cut them down, and that's just a natural reaction of the tree called compartmentalization or walling off, and it's a way for the tree to prevent microbes from getting in there, spreading throughout the tree and causing disease. They are literally walling off those areas so that sap will never pass through that stained wood again. Sugar is never stored in there anymore. There may be sugar still in those areas, but you're never going to get to it. It's kind of locked inside the wall. And if you end up with too much of this throughout the tree, this tree really isn't too bad. But if you end up with too much through over-tapping or cluster tapping in a particular area, it could impair the ability of the tree to transmit water up to the leaves or to store sugars, and neither of those things are particularly good for the tree or particularly good for a sugar maker wanting to get syrup out of it. So balancing this kind of wound with the amount of sap that you're getting out is really critical in terms of sustainable maple syrup production. That you hit stained wood, you're going to lose about 0.75% in terms of yield. So if you're out there and you're tapping, and about 10% of the time you're hitting stained wood, which isn't at all an unusual type of thing for some areas, 10% of the time you're hitting stained wood, you've lost about 7.5% of your potential yield from that section of your woods. That's not a great thing. You think about some areas of wood, of trees that have been in production for many, many years. Maybe your grandfather was tapping them and he was hanging 4 or 5 buckets on those trees with 7/16 inch. It doesn't make any difference whether you're on vacuum or not, but if you're using bigger spouts, making a much bigger wound. So, for many, many years they got really heavily tapped. They're not growing real fast and that big. So maybe you're hitting stained wood 20% of the time. You lost 15% of your sap yield. that's not good. You should think about doing something else. Well, one way to keep track of this is to periodically examine your drill shavings when you're tapping. You're always going to have a little bit of bark, and we've separated it out here, but if you're wood, when you're tapping, you catch the shavings. It looks like this, probably a good Taphole, unless this is really, really dry and brittle wood, in which case the tree is dead. But if it comes out looking like this, it's creamy white, it's a little bit damp, but not real wet, then it's a good Taphole. If you hit something like this, you have bark, and then you also hit a lot of this brown stuff, you're really not going to get anything out of that. Sap will not move through stained wood. So it's important to avoid things like this where you have really short drop lines, 7/16 inch spouts, you're putting a lot of spouts. There's 4 taps on this tree, and it's barely, probably a 2-tapper. If you see all this area is just peppered with tap holes, probably very, very little live wood in there for you to actually get. It doesn't matter how many drops you put on this line, you're just not going to get a lot of sap out of that tree. You need to do something different. So what can you do? Well, the first thing is use smaller spouts. If you use a 7/16 or 5/16 spout, 1964 spout creates a wound about half the size of 7/16 inch spout. You can use the proper number of tap holes based upon the tapping guidelines in your area. You can space out the tap holes to make sure you're not doing that cluster tapping and killing sections of the wood. You can use longer drop lines. Anytime you have a longer drop line, you're going to be able to access more of the tapping band, spread that wound out, and that will reduce the probability you're going to hit an old tap hole when you actually tap. You can monitor stained wood by catching the shavings periodically. You don't need to do that all the time, but if you're in a section of the woods you know previously you've hit stain quite a bit, then it's a worthwhile thing to check. Make sure you utilize the full tapping band when you are actually tapping. Don't tap on just the south side of the tree. Research was done back in the 30s and 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s that showed tapping around the entire tapping band over time gives you the best results. If you always tap on the south, you're gonna end up with problems. Similarly, don't always just tap under a large branch or over a large root. There's no truth to that you're gonna get more. Utilize the full tapping band all the way around the tree.
I'm sorry, what did you say that the reduction in yield was on tap on stained wood?
For every percent of time that you hit stained wood, on average, you're going to reduce your sap yield by 0.75%. So if you hit it 10% of the time, you've reduced your potential sap yields by 7.5%. Okay. Other questions?
What about smaller 1/4-inch spouts?
1/4-inch spouts do make a slightly smaller wound, but they also produce less sap. The 1/4-inch spout, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, is a spout that's looking to solve a problem that it wasn't designed to solve. 1/4-inch spout was designed back in 2007, 2008, when there was no syrup in the strategic reserve, and syrup prices spiked. So manufacturers said, how can we get syrup into the market right away? So they came up with the idea of tapping with a 1/4-inch spout in the fall, make syrup into the winter, go back in the spring, pull the 1/4-inch spouts, ream them out to 5/16, put a 5/16 inch spout, and make syrup in the spring. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. The tap holes dry out, you don't get much from them in the spring. So the 1/4-inch, that whole idea for why the 1/4-inch spout was designed didn't work. Well, they still have those molds, they still can make the spouts, they'd be happy to sell them to you. If you're having a lot of problems and you have slow growth rates in your trees, it might be one way to help solve the problem, but you're gonna get 10 to 12% less sap out of a 1/4-inch spout than you will 5/16. No question.
But if you can tighten them up better and keep the vacuum higher, can you gain on that end?
I don't know that anybody's shown that that's the case, that there's a big difference in tightness with a 1/4-inch spout and a 5/16 spout. They're pretty similar. But we do know for sure yields are lower with a 1/4-inch spout.
How much wood is that actually damaged? What's the area around the tap?
In general, at least visually, the wound around a taphole is just a little bit wider than the taphole is and a little bit deeper than the taphole is, but it extends above and below the taphole quite a long ways, and that's because of the anatomy of the tree. The vessels are oriented mostly up and down, so that's where they'll travel. With a small spout, it can be fairly minor, depends on the growth rate of the tree too, so it might be a foot above, foot below. 7/16-inch spout could be a couple of feet. It really varies though, partly depending upon the genetics of the tree. Trees are like all sorts of living organisms. They respond differently to stresses and wounds. So some people heal up a lot faster than others. Some trees just naturally heal up faster than others, partly due to their genetics, partly due to their health situation that they're currently in. So it's hard to give a good number that that works everywhere. Because you cut a tree down, you might look at it and say, no, he was wrong. This isn't the same. But we've cut hundreds and hundreds of trees, and we have a pretty good idea what the relationships are on average. Okay, I'm going to continue to move on. So make sure you utilize the full tapping band when you are tapping. Avoid cluster tapping. And then make sure your spouts are driven into the right depth. And that I'll talk about a little bit more later on. So really what we're trying to do is get that balance between wounding and yield to sustainably make syrup, but at the same time make a decent net out of it. Well, another way that you might be able to extend that tapping band is to tap below the lateral line. And this is a study we did, Mark and I did in 2015, 2016. So if we start, this is the amount of sap yield, and these are the different treatments we did. So if we tapped the normal way we would, where we just went out and tapped the trees, above the lateral line, we ended up with 30.6 gallons of sap. These were decent sized trees, around 14 to 18 inches diameter. So 30.6 inches, and you look at that and say that's a good yield. But if we separate out those tap holes that we know we hit stain versus those that we didn't hit stain, when we didn't hit stain, we produced 34 gallons of sap. For those 25% of the time in this section of our woods, those trees have been tapped for a long, long time. 25% of the time, even carefully tapping, we were hitting stain. And in that case, we were only producing 14 gallons of sap out of those tap holes. If instead of tapping above and sort of taking our chances 25% of the time that we were going to hit stain, we simply inverted the drop line and tapped below, we ended up with 33.8 gallons of sap per tap. And we know that we were going to hit sound wood every time. We'd never tapped down there. Trees had never been tapped below the lateral line. So essentially 100% of the time we were going to hit good wood. There's a couple of different ways to do that. We have some publications on this. So if you're looking to do this, the key things to tapping below the lateral line are you have really good vacuum and you have really good sanitation. If you have those two factors, then tapping below the lateral line really is not going to cause any additional yields and one thing, or any additional loss in yield. If you go even further and have even better sanitation, this was tapping below with a check valve, and we could boost the yields a little bit better because we had slightly better sanitation. So that's a pretty decent method for those trees where no matter what you're going to do, you're going to hit stain a good percentage of the time. Just simply switch to tapping below the lateral line. There are entire sections of our woods now that we don't even look above the lateral line anymore. We just know those trees have been hammered for a long time, and every tap is below the lateral line, at least for a period of time until the trees have grown enough wood back above the lateral line for us to start tapping there again.
Very quick question on that.
Yep.
Is that 5/16 or 3/16 drops?
Those are 5/16. Yeah. Unless I mention it, most of this is going to be on 5/16. Yeah.
When you tap below, does it make a big difference how far below?
We always went in the study 2 feet below. We had 2 foot drop lines, either above or below. So we always went. So the key thing there, if you tap below, is rather than normally your spout goes in this way, you want to keep that orientation so that it's still got a little loop down below, rather than inverting the tap, and that way it will keep like a little air gap in the spout and in the drop line itself, so your sanitation's a little bit better. Question over here?
Would you recommend tapping in a pattern or just kind of randomly going?
We don't, and partly because our woods have been tapped for a long. So the question is, do we recommend tapping in a pattern, or do we just look at the tree? We don't, because the trees have been tapped for a long time, so it would be hard to start a pattern and keep to it.
That's how my sugar woods are, because I bought it from somebody that's been tapped for a few years.
Yeah.
I think it's random.
Some people do. We prefer to look at the tree and do what the tree is kind of telling us to do. The other reason I don't like pattern tapping is because some people will say, I'm going to start on the south side of the tree, and they're going to tap just on the south, and the next side just on the east, and then on the west, and then on the north. What that does is, if you have a season where you have really good flows on the south and you tap every tree on the south, you're going to get great production. But if you have a season where it's hot and it's not good flows on the south, you're going to have a crappy season. Every tree is going to run poorly because they're going to dry out earlier. So what we think is better is spread that risk around by tapping all the way around the tree. So some will be tapped on the north, some on the south. There's been research done at the Proctor Center and others years and years ago. You're better off spreading that risk around. On average, over several years, you're going to find that the average yields are the same no matter what side you tap on. So we'd rather spread it around and really try to read the tree as opposed to just do something that's imposed on us by a grid pattern.
Do you have any issues with late season snow covering spouts or anything below level?
Late season snow covering, I'm not sure I understand.
People are tapping earlier now, and last March we got 3 feet of snow.
Yeah. It's hard to see. Like even yesterday, it's hard to see when the tree's half covered with snow when you're going out trying to tap it.
Having snow, covering the drop, that.
No, we haven't yet so far, but our lateral lines are often fairly high anyway because we get some deep snow on some years at the Proctor Center. So even when we're tapping below the lateral line, it's still fairly high off the ground.
What's the elevation up there?
We start at about 1250 and go up to 16 better. We're right up there. Okay, gonna move along here. Okay, so this actually gets to that question of spout size. So 7/16, this is spout diameter with sap yield. 7/16 and 5/16 are pretty close on vacuum. Not the case on the gravity, it's a little bit different. But on vacuum, 5/16 is really close, maybe within 3 to 4% of a 7/16 spout. Partly because the 7/16 tend to stick in the tree better than a 7/16 will. Just the better, newer types of spouts with a different taper. But and so not a lot of difference there. But as you start to drop off smaller and smaller, 1/4 inch, you're going to lose about 10 to 12%. 3/16 you're down to only about 75% or so of what a 5/16 will give you. 5/32, even less. It's just this natural tendency to drop off in yield. These are all of the same depth of taphole. This, that you probably can't read at all, is a study that was done by Sanitation in Quebec, and same types of patterns. You see this fairly level, minor drop off down as far as 5/16. This 5/16 spout, when it was introduced, it largely, in my opinion, saved the Canadian maple industry. If they had continued tapping with 7/16s at the intensities they did, they would have had some real sustainability issues. 5/16 spouts create a much smaller wound. The research that went into this and really did a marvelous thing for both Quebec and for the maple industry overall. Okay. Spout color. The bottom line in spout color is if you can tell me what the season is going to be like today, I can tell you what color spout to use. So I'm just offering that. Anybody wants to come ask me, I'll be happy to tell you one way or another. Generally, black spouts, this is the normal color image and this is the false color image. A black spout will heat up quite a lot more than a white spout. This is the white spout. This is the white spout. So you can see these spouts, the temperature was about 17 degrees. These spouts are above freezing at 17 degrees on a sunny, windless day. Green spout didn't warm up quite as much as a black. White warmed up just a hair. Clear spouts, same kind of thing, they just don't warm up. If it's a cold year, black spouts will tend to do a little better. If it's a warm year, lighter color or clear spouts will do a little better. If you have a normally cold sugar bush, well, then maybe going to a darker colored spout is a good idea. If you have a normally warm sugar bush, then going to a lighter colored spout might be a good idea. But otherwise, it's kind of crapshoot. You don't know what the season's going to be like, so you can't really pick a color. So pick spouts that you like for some other reason than color, unless you have a normally cold or normally hot. So there was a study that came out that said, white spouts do better, and yeah, they do. They did in 1 year. This is a white spout. This is clear, white, one kind of black, another kind of black. So for 1 year, white spouts did better, and that was the year that study was done. But in 2014, a year before, a clear spout did better. 2016, black spouts did better. 2017, black spouts did better. All depends on the year. Now, very clearly, 2012, a black spout was a bad idea. But you didn't know that until March, when the temperature hit about 70 degrees and your spouts probably hit about 90 degrees. It just shut everything right off if you had a black spout. So we tend to like to go with clear spouts. But really, it doesn't matter a whole lot. The reason we go with clear spouts is it allows us to see if there are leaks that are in the taphole. The problem with that is that people who are just starting, which is probably none of you, but people who are just starting see the bubbles coming out of the taphole in a clear spout, and they think, oh, that's a leak. I'm going to hit it a little harder. And they hit it harder, and they look again, and it's still got bubbles coming out. So they hit it harder again, and then maybe by the time they're done with a sledgehammer, they get a lot of leaks. Those little tiny bubbles that are coming out of the taphole are normal. Trees produce two things coming out of the taphole: liquid, sap, and gases. Gases are normal coming out of the tree. As long as they're moving slowly and they're fairly small, that's okay. If they're moving real fast and you got a lot of them, that's a leak. So fix the leaks, but leave the bubbles alone. We're just not making enough sap to make it work. So then we go up to here. This is where we sort of hit the peak, the sweet spot for production. A 1.5 inch taphole is really the best balance between good sap or syrup production and the size of the wound that you produce. Maybe if you want to increase yields and your trees are growing well, then you could go up to 2 inches and you're going to make more syrup and your wound to syrup ratio isn't terrible, but as you go deeper and deeper, it's going to just drop off faster and faster. So somewhere in this range, 1.5 to 2 inch, maximizes production and at the same time increasing sustainability of the trees. So these small wounds, these Tapholes produce really small wounds, but not enough sap for producers. By the time you get up to 2.5 inches, you're getting more sap out of it, but you're also making a pretty big wound. So somewhere in this range, probably the best. Just right, that's the Goldilocks zone. So I mentioned earlier about tapping spouts in. This is a study that was done by Dr. Mike Recklin in West Virginia. He did it really, it was a very short study, just at the very end of the season, because there was a producer down there who had a problem in 2018. And the problem stemmed from a problem they'd had the previous couple of years. They'd had a lot of spout heaving. So the woods manager said, well, we're going to solve that problem. We're going to pound those spouts right in as far as we can pound them. So in 2018, they pounded spouts right up to almost that hill. So what happens when you do that? This is at the correct place in tapping, so we're going to call that 100%. If you drive them all the way in, you're down at about the 37% range of potential sap yield. You've cut off, you've sealed off a lot of potential area for the sap to flow into that taphole. If you just partially overdrive them, it still doesn't help you very much. You're maybe up a little over 40%. So there's a really steep curve between a little bit overdriven and doing it right. So when you're talking to your tappers, or if you're tapping yourself, put the spouts in to where they're supposed to be. How do you do that? Two ways, two decent ways. One is a lot of spouts are coming with marks on them now. Put them into that line. Don't put them in any further. But really the best way is sound. You're hitting them, ding, ding, ding. When it changes, it's done. That's it. Leave it there. Don't hit it again. Or if you hit it again, don't hit it real hard. Because once it's in the right place, that's 100%. Anything more you do to drive it in further is just going to start coming down this line. And that line is a pretty steep line. You're gonna reduce your sap yields really fast by driving them in further. We're going to repeat this this year at the Proctor Center to try to get some better data on it, but at this point, this is all we have, and what it tells us is overdriving spouts is a really bad idea. The producer down in West Virginia who did this is probably out of business because he produced only about 35% of what he thought he was going to produce, which wasn't a lot of syrup. So that one mistake, one really bad mistake, put this guy out of business. So current tapping guidelines, they're all sort of all over the place. Canadian Organic 1 tap 8 inches, Vermont Organic 9, New York Organic 10, Traditional 10, Maine Organic 10. So you can see just for the organic, it's sort of all over the place. Conservative, these are the old tapping guidelines of 7/16. And then when you start looking even closer, Canadian Organic 8, and then it jumps up to 16, double the size for 2 taps, whereas 9 jumps up to 15. New York, which is more conservative with 1 tap than Vermont or Canada, only goes up to 14. So this just illustrates that a lot of these aren't really based on science, they're more based on practice that's evolved over the years and the certifying agency or whoever you're talking to. It's kind of a all over the place. And so what we're trying to do is develop more robust guidelines that are science-based, and that's taking a lot of time because there's a lot of factors involved. One thing that's been kind of interesting, Tim Wilmot did some studies a few years ago looking at the when you put in a second spout under vacuum, how much more sap you get out of it. Well, because of the way sap flows in trees under gravity and vacuum, if you take like an 18-inch tree on gravity and you tap it, put a second spout in it, you're going to get 95, close to 100% more sap. It's not going to be as much sap as you get under vacuum, but you're going to get about double the amount of sap with a second spout. Now on vacuum, because you're drawing from a much larger area within the tree, instead of doubling it on a 16-inch size tree, you're only going to get about 50% more. Now that doesn't mean you get 100% on the first taphole and 50% on the second. It gets spread across the tube. As you get larger in size though, so it's a 19-inch tree, you're going to increase the amount of sap because the pools you're drawing from start getting further and further apart. So it's just one thing to keep in mind, that under vacuum, under good vacuum, good sanitation conditions, a second taphole in a maple tree doesn't double the amount of sap until you get to a really sizable tree. So if we look, another thing that's important in getting good yields is when you actually tap. And this was some work that Tim Woolon again did back in 2007, 2006, 7, and 8. Joe Orfici at Cornell and now at Yale repeated this work in 2018. And essentially you see this kind of pattern. If you have good vacuum, you have really good sanitation, and you tap in mid-January, you tend to get the best yields as long as you're prepared to capture that sap and process it into syrup. If you don't let it run on the ground until mid-March, you're not going to have that happen. And if you tap in mid-February, you're going to see some loss in potential sap for the spring. If you tap right before the season starts, you're going to get even less sap. So it isn't a problem tapping early as long as you're doing it with good vacuum, good sanitation. Okay, so sanitation is the next topic, and I'm not going to talk about this a whole lot because my whole next presentation is on it, but during the freeze-thaw cycle, sap from the drop lines can get pulled back into the taphole. Happens when mechanical releasers dump, they create these small pulses of movement of sap backward. Anytime the pump actually stops, so if your power goes out or you shut it off for some reason to fix it or something else happens, you get these surges of sap that can flow back both in the lateral line and in the drop line. That sap goes into the taphole. The wood filters out any microbes that were in the drop lines, and they stay in the taphole where they are nice and happy and they grow really fast and encourage that walling off process. So anytime you have leaks in the tubing or any type of backflow, you get that episodic movement of sap. And it can happen several feet back into the tubing system. We call it backflow. Several feet refers to 5/16. It can happen in 3/16 as well, but it's way worse. You can get sap moving back tens of feet in the drop line and lateral line system. So 3/16 systems aren't in any way protected from this. Any of these times you get to backflow events, the microbes end up in the taphole, and that's a bad thing because the presence and the abundance and the type is going to cause that wound response in the tree, and it happens way faster than you'd think. It happens about halfway through the season. It really kicks in and keeps going right to the end of the season. So that natural wound response isn't there to keep the sap from going out as much as it is to keep the microbes from growing into the tree and causing disease or death. So we know that because we measured it for many, many years. It depends on how clean you can keep your drop lines and spouts in particular. Not going to go through that. We have this spreadsheet on our website now where you can plug in lots of different things, so how much sap you average, how old your tubing system is, how much you value your sap in dollars, and then all the different costs. So anywhere there's a red box here, you can plug in a variable for your cost, and you plug in how much bulk price of syrup is, and it ends up spitting out some type of result, and the result will tell you what will happen if you change your sanitation method. So you can go grab that off our website and play around with it a little bit if you like, but in general, what you're going to find is something like this. This is a summary for 5/16-inch spouts under vacuum, looking at different types of sanitation. This is a 10-year average from studies done at Proctor, and Cornell between 2009 and 2018. So a lot of data went into this. I'm not going to guarantee you're going to get this kind of stuff, but these are the general types of patterns. You do have arrow bars on there so you can see how much variability there is. So this is the type of treatment, sanitation treatment that you use, and the sap yield improvement over doing nothing. If you just didn't clean anything, just pulled your spouts, that was all you did. And so any of these things are above the doing nothing. And what it shows is two things. It shows the sap yield improvement you get, and then it also shows the net profit you get. And the net profit, we're going to assume in this illustration that we're getting a sap yield of 15 gallons per tap, which is fairly reasonable for a lot of producers, and the sap is worth about 51 cents a gallon, which is about what it is for average sap at the current bulk price. So if you do nothing else, then replace your spouts every year. Because it'll get you about a 32% improvement in sap yield, and it'll net you a net profit of about $1 a tap. Now, some people say, I don't want to spend 15, 20 cents on a new spout each year. We've subtracted out the 15 or 20 cents from this. So this is the net profit you get from the cost of the buying the new spout and installing it. So there's a little bit of labor install. So that's the net profit. If instead you want to do other types of things, one approach is to use a check valve, and you see this as check valve and spout, because when you put the check valve in, you're actually getting two effects. You're getting a check valve effect and the spout effect. When you do that, again, this is an average of 36 different studies at Cornell and Proctor. You get an average of about 67, 68% improvement in sap yield and a net profit of about 210. So this line here, because we were doing all these studies and combining them, that line shows the contribution of a new spout to this overall effect. So in this case, over lots and lots of studies, about a third of the total effect of a check valve spout is due to the spout alone. The rest is due to the fact that it's a check valve in there. So you might hear people say, wow, you know, this improvement due to the check valve is due to the fact that you put a new spout in there. Yes, that's built into it, but it is only part of it, and the majority of it is coming from the check valve. If instead of that you want to do a new drop in a new spout, so you're getting the drop effect, you're getting the spout effect at the same time, what you're going to find is if you have really old tubing and you replace it, you're going to get a really big boost in net profit and yield. So this is over 70% improvement on average, producing $2.29 per tap. That's if your tubing is old and you put a brand new drop on there. The contribution of the spout in this case was again about a third to the overall drop effect. The closer you are to the tree, the more important it is. But because you don't want to do this every year, you're not going to get that same net profit or the same boost each year. What most people will do is replace the drop lines at intervals. And so if you do it every 3 years, first year you get that effect, the second year it drops down, the third year it drops down about here. And so on average, over a 3-year interval for replacing drop lines, you end up with a net profit of about $1.66 and an improvement of about 50%. If you use bleach, two different ways of doing it, the right way and the wrong way. The right way is you have to have a sufficient contact time. If you simply suck bleach solution in under vacuum, there is not enough contact time, and essentially it's a wash. You don't net any positive value, but it doesn't really have a negative impact on you either. If you clean it and you have good long contact times, though, your net profits can be about equal to a brand new drop line, so about $2.
What do you mean by long contact versus short contact?
Okay, so when you read the container for most of these sanitizers, they say minimum contact time 5 to 10 minutes. So you gotta put it in there, leave it there for at least that length of time. And then, because it's Clorox, you need to either let some of the first sap run on the ground or rinse it out afterwards. So all of this $2 includes that, includes subtracting out the lost sap or the extra time on rinsing. But you need at least a 5 to 10 minute contact time for that to work. So the way some people are doing it is they actually have their drop lines on quick disconnects, bring them in, rinse them in a Clorox solution, or put them in a Clorox solution for at least 10 minutes, rinse them in water, bring them back out and put them in the woods. If you have a lot of taps, that becomes a real problem quickly. I'm going to finish up here real fast. Peroxide, don't use it, doesn't do much of anything. Zatback, antimicrobial spout, falls in a little bit better than a regular spout. IPA is used in Canada. It's sort of intermediate between a new spout and some of these other methods.
Question?
IPA though, I just want to say this. You don't use IPA in the US. It's illegal. EPA will not be happy. What we don't want to happen is the EPA coming after the maple industry saying you're using an illegal pesticide in maple food production.
If you use IPA in a new spout, are you going to gain on that?
No, we've done all that research. You gain a tiny amount, but the tiny amount you gain is then subtracted off by the cost of the new spout and the labor to put it out there. So it ends up being a wash. So if you're going to use IPA, new spout's not going to help you that much.
I know the problem with Clorox, if any of it gets back into the tree, it's supposed to be extremely harmful for the tree. What's your take on that?
Trees don't like salt, and Clorox is a salt. It's a sodium salt. They don't like sodium. So that is a bad thing. You don't want to squirt a lot of this out around. So if you put it in your drop lines, suck it out and drain it down to your system. The problem, trees don't like it, squirrels do. And we don't like using Clorox because I think for many, many years we trained squirrels to like maple tubing, and we've finally gotten away from that where we don't get that much squirrel problem. Occasionally you get the crazy squirrel who wants to chew on anything, but it isn't widespread everywhere. And so we aren't really recommending it at this point. We are looking at other types of bleach, though, a calcium-based bleach, and we've been doing that for years, but it isn't something we can recommend yet. We just don't have enough time. I gotta really fly through this. Okay, vacuum's simple. The more you pull, the better. It doesn't hurt the tree. Every increase of 1 inch of vacuum gets you 5 to 7% more. We did that back in 2004. Another study at UVM said about 7%. Center Acer and Cornell saying that it's somewhere in the range of 6 to 7. So the more you pull, the more you get. It doesn't cause any damage to the tree. So the main thing for that comes to make sure you design your systems properly, lay them out properly, install them, maintain them properly. Just some simple rule here is that if you have a dual mainline system, you tend to get about 10% higher sap yields than a single mainline system. So monitoring is really critical. Doesn't really help to have a great vacuum pump pulling 27 inches at the sugar house if you got 12 inches out in the woods. So these are just some examples. Thinning would, don't have time to go through all of these, but thinning is a really good idea to increase your yields. Adding taps, that's another possible way. If over 10 years, if you add taps to it, you're going to get a decent amount back for that. 5 to 10 taps is if you're doing it yourself, not paying somebody. 2,000 tap bush, if you hit stained wood 10% of the time, it's going to cost you about $19,000 over 10 years. If you increase your spout sanitation and you gain just $1.50 more tap, you're going to get 30,000 K and more, or 30,000 more over 10 years in net income. If you increase your vacuum level by just 5 inches, you're going to gain 25 or 35% more and get 42 to 59,000 more dollars. Of course, you have to subtract out the cost of the pump and maintenance for that, but still, think you can buy a heck of a pump for $42,000 to $59,000. So in summary, if you use best management practices, you're going to get higher sap yields. You can generate higher net profits doing that if you do it right. Every one of the options that you choose comes at a different cost and is going to generate a different amount of sap yield and financial yield depending on how you do it. And producers just really need to think about what approaches are going to work for them and which are going to result in the biggest impact at the highest, biggest impact at the lowest cost. So, and really, it's all we need to do is find a lot more kids like this, and I think we'd be all set. Thank you. Actually, I have a little bit of time for questions. If you have to move to another site, feel free to do that. But I do have a little bit of time for questions too.
I have a question.
Yeah. Yeah.
I took over my neighbor's sugar operation, and he has at least 10 taps over lateral line as his average.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I can simply go up to where it hits 5 and make that the end of the line trade.
Yeah.
And then the remaining 5 uphill from that just runs 5 6 feet down another saddle on the main line.
Yeah.
Would that be fun, or is that too far of a distance?
No, distance. No.
Distance is not the effect.
Distance is not quite as critical as the number of taps on the line.
Well, I always wonder that if it's the number of taps or distance of lateral.
We've done a lot of research looking at that. The best from a sap yield standpoint is 1 tap per lateral.
Right.
You just can't afford to do it. And we've looked at a lot of other ways to do it. Some of them actually are better in terms of sap yield, but it just costs you too much to do it. So with the current prices, the way we're doing it, using the rule of strive for 5, no more than 10 on a lateral line, seems to work good for 5 16-inch tubing. 3 16ths is a different animal.
So if he's got 10, then probably just leave it alone. No sense in dividing it up in 5.
Yep. Yep. 10 is going to drop off a little bit in yield.
Probably 15 even a lot.
If you're above 10, certainly cutting down is probably a good idea.
Okay.
Non-clean tubing